This is the 15th video in a series that is designed to help you give useful information to the Jehovah's Witnesses so that they can make an informed decision about their religious beliefs. In each video I give you background information and then suggest what you can say and what questions to ask. In this series you'll be studying with the Jehovah's Witnesses and their favorite publication, the book, What Does the Bible Really Teach? You'll be reading each paragraph and answering the questions at the bottom of each page. You don't need to agree with everything in the paragraph. Just reply by saying something like, your paragraph here says such and such, and then give the answer right from the book. Frequently you should tell the witness and let them know that the things that you're reading in the book are also accepted in the mainstream Christian evangelical community. Everything except what's discussed in these videos. You should keep in mind the principles of Colossians 4, chapters 4, verses 5 and 6, and 1 Peter 3, verse 15, and be gracious and respectful of their beliefs. You should adopt the attitude of a newspaper interviewer and never do any direct teaching, but only asking questions. Maybe asking leading questions or asking questions that include some material, but don't do any direct teaching. Just passively listen to what the Jehovah's Witnesses have to teach, and then when you reach these key issues that are discussed in these videos, then you ask the questions. At times you may need to remind the Jehovah's Witnesses that their own book in chapter 1, paragraphs 4 and 23, encourages you to ask questions and to search for satisfying answers because you want the truth from the Bible. This issue today starts on page 130 of their book, paragraphs 13 through paragraph 16. And we're going to prepare for this. The way you're going to prepare for it is in the book, in the margin, you're going to write 5 Bible passages. Only the first one is the really important one, but the others are of use. The first one is 1 Corinthians 10, verses 18 through 33. Next, Mark 7, verse 19. Matthew 15, verse 11. Colossians 2, verses 16 through 23. 1 Timothy 4, verses 3 through 5. Here's what's going on in their book. The Jehovah's Witnesses teach that it has always been wrong to eat blood, and since eating it is the same as injecting it, it is therefore a serious sin to take a blood transfusion, like in the arm. They get this from several Bible verses, primarily in Acts chapter 15. There are several possible responses to this, but I think this one in this video that I'll be giving is the best of all. There are 4 rules given by the apostles here in Acts 15. The first 3 are dietary rules. That's no eating of things sacrificed to idols, no eating of blood, no eating of strangled animals. The 4th is a moral rule, no fornication. These rules were already being kept by Jewish converts to Christianity, and now the apostles were extending them to Gentile converts. We're going to get into some more details now. You don't need to memorize all these details, and you certainly don't need to share them with the Jehovah's Witnesses. You just need to have them in your mind, and it'd be good to be familiar with them in case you're asked and you have more to say. Okay? A major clue in figuring this issue out of what does Acts 15 mean and about these 4 rules, what do we do with that, is knowing that the first dietary rule, that's eating of things sacrificed to idols, is mentioned in only 4 places in the whole Bible. Here in Acts 15, again in Acts 21:25, where all 4 rules are listed, but there's no discussion. Then in Revelation 2:20, 2 of the rules are given, not eating things sacrificed to idols, and the last one about no fornication. But again, no discussion is given. And lastly, in the book of 1 Corinthians, a large discussion on this for things eating, what you can eat and what you shouldn't eat, chapters 8 through 10. and on fornication, chapters 5 through 7. So from chapters 5 through chapters 10, all address these 4 rules, because in chapters 8 through 10, it discusses not just eating things sacrificed to idols, but also eating things that a Jew wouldn't eat, and what are the guiding principles there. So we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians and find our answer. I'm going to give you the context of Acts 15 first, then we'll move to 1 Corinthians. In Acts 15, it's about a controversy that occurred when Gentiles were converting from their beliefs into Christianity. Now at that time, all Christians were Jews. They'd been Jews that were now converted. And these Jews had customs that were developed from the Old Testament law of Moses and adapted for living among Gentiles. So these rules had kind of become commandments, and they were all keeping them. So as these Gentiles converted to Christianity, and they were side by side with Jews who held to these other rules, the question came up, well, should these Gentiles also hold these same rules that were extensions of the Old Testament law of Moses? Well, the apostles decided that one of the issues, the issue of circumcision, that was something that did not need to be kept by Gentiles, even though that commandment was in the Old Testament law and even predated the Old Testament law. It was one that did not need to be applied to the Gentiles, and even the Jewish Christians didn't need to keep that. But these 4 other rules, and we're going to find out more about those rules and why, but they were already being kept by the Jews, the Christian Jews, but they should be extended to Gentile converts. We're going to, as I said, we're going to learn a little bit more about that. Let's look at those 4 rules. The 4 rules, again, are from Acts 15, verses 28 and 29, and again repeated in Acts 21:25. And here they are. First of all, abstain from things sacrificed to idols. These would be the animal sacrifices and maybe other things, but primarily animals, meat. Okay? It's also mentioned in Revelation 2:20 and 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. And we learn from chapters 8 through 10 that this is not just abstaining from things, idols, that you can't touch them. It's meant you couldn't eat them. Okay? That was the point. And that's what 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10 is about. There was no Old Testament law that specifically addressed eating things sacrificed to idols. It was not an established law. It would never come up, because the Jews already had a law not to offer up food to idols. No idolatry of any kind was allowed. So there wouldn't be a need to talk about food that had been offered to idols. So there was no guidance on what to do, and if that food was offered to idols and then resold in some market, which is what the Gentiles did, including in the city of Corinth, which Paul wrote his book in his letter Corinthians. But the Jews figured out what was the thing to do, and they had this custom: don't eat things sacrificed to idols. It's wrong. Okay? Number 2, okay? Abstain from blood. Now again, you may wonder, well, what does abstain mean? Well, in this context, and looking at the Jewish law that was practiced, is that this meant don't eat blood. Right? That was an Old Testament principle, and it was being carried forward, so these Jews were already not doing that. It didn't mean that you had to drain the blood from your body. It didn't mean that you couldn't touch it in some sense. For example, if you worked in a zoo and you were to feed certain kinds of meat or other things to animals in the zoo, sometimes some animals will only eat live prey. Okay, this law does not forbid that. It doesn't forbid working with touching your own blood, or as you know, people in the medical field deal with testing blood for certain diseases and diagnosing diseases. This rule is about, as I said, eating the blood. And it's derived from an Old Testament verse that dealt with what humans could eat. This is Leviticus chapter 17, verses 10 through 15. It's not about what animals could eat, whether you could feed blood to an animal. That was not covered in the Old Testament law. So the Jews of Paul's day would encounter bloody meat products in the grocery market, and these Jews would be careful not to eat it, and therefore, likewise, Christianized Jews would still have that custom and say, I'm not going to eat that. This is morally, they would think, morally wrong, or it was make them impure and defiled before God. All right? That led to number 3, abstain from things strangled. Now, there was no Old Testament law that specifically mentioned this, to stay away from animals that were strangled, or not to eat things strangled, but it could be deduced from the previous rule about not eating blood. You wouldn't eat a strangled animal because it still had its blood in it. It hadn't been drained properly. So this didn't mean that you couldn't touch a strangled animal or that you couldn't strangle an animal yourself. It meant you weren't to eat it. So that's what abstain means in this context, and the Jews of that day, or the Christianized Jews, would be careful when they went to the meat market not to eat something that had been strangled. That would be their custom that they had developed. And this would be what Paul was addressing in 1 Corinthians 8 through 10, where he talks about buying meat in the Corinthian meat market. This leads to the 4th rule about abstaining from fornication. Here, abstain is clear what it means. It doesn't mean you can't talk about it and what the Bible says about it. It means you can't participate in it. Now, what's surprising about this rule, you might think, oh, this rule is in the Old Testament. Actually, it's not. The Old Testament law of Moses did not forbid fornication or prostitution. There were laws that regulated it. That if there was a case of a young man and a young woman and they were not engaged and they committed fornication, there was no law against that. The boy would have to pay a bride price, but that was it. It wasn't a punishment. It was just that's what he had to pay. It wasn't forbidden like other moral sins were forbidden. Leviticus 19:29 made prostitution, that was a shameful thing, but prostitution was not forbidden, as you can see from reading 1 Kings 3:16, where Solomon was judging between 2 prostitutes, not because of what they were doing, but because of one of the children had died. So prostitutes were allowed. It was considered shameful, but they were allowed, and this was true up until in Jesus' day. And the Jews had developed a custom or a rule that prostitution was considered sinful. So it would say, oh, this woman is a sinner, meaning a prostitute. It wasn't forbidden under the Old Testament law, but by that time, it was a part of the Jewish custom that it was considered sinful and shameful. However, here in Acts 15, in these 4 rules that we're looking at, fornication, prostitution became absolutely forbidden in all situations and all circumstances. All right, now looking at rules 1 through 3, which were dietary rules about eating, things that the Jews considered to be defiling, that would defile you before God. Did this view that you shouldn't eat those things, did that contradict what Jesus said in Mark 7:19 and Matthew 15, verse 11? There Jesus said that all foods were clean and may be eaten. They didn't defile you. And they wouldn't necessarily be healthy. You can eat rocks and that didn't defile you before God, but it's not a very healthy thing. So apparently, no, not just apparently, but Jesus at these verses declared these foods as no longer unclean morally, or for as far as the purity laws, they were, or cleanliness laws, they were no longer unclean. They could be eaten. But in Acts 15, the apostles seem to say that, no, you shouldn't eat these things. Well, which is correct? What Jesus said or what the apostle said? How do we put these 2 things together? Is there some answer that combines what Jesus said with what the apostle said in Acts 15 and put them together? The answer is yes. Paul puts these 2 together in 1 Corinthians, specifically chapters 8 through 10. So again, as mentioned before, a clue to solving this is noting that that first rule, eating of things sacrificed to idols, is mentioned in only 4 places in the whole Bible, and only once is it truly discussed, and that's in 1 Corinthians. So that's where we're next going to turn for an answer. Now note that 1 Corinthians was probably written after the events of Acts 15, probably around the time of Acts 19. So it was after. So it would be reasonable that Paul would be commenting on something that this rule, that these four rules that the apostles had written about in or stated in Acts chapter 15. In 1 Corinthians chapters 5 through 7, Paul discusses that fourth rule about no fornication. And he says it's absolutely forbidden. It's always morally wrong. It's not a dietary purity issue. It's morally wrong. Then in the next three chapters, chapters 8 through 10, Paul specifically mentions the first of those three dietary rules about eating things sacrificed to idols. And he starts discussing this, and he's discussing things, dietary issues in general. So it would be reasonable that it's not just the first dietary issue, but it's the other two as well, are being addressed in chapters 8 through 10. He reaches his final important conclusions in chapter 10, verses 18 through 33. I'm going to get familiar with that. There he explains that eating these things could be wrong, would be wrong in most cases in that situations at that time. But if eating those things could be done in a way that wouldn't stumble an observer, he wasn't worried about his own conscience or the person that's eating, but those watching and observing it, he says, then it would be okay to eat it as long as it didn't stumble someone else. But if it might stumble someone else, then it was a firm rule. Don't eat these things, including no blood. Okay? But that was at that situation, at that time, and it was very much dependent upon the circumstance, because most Christians had a Jewish background and would not like this, eating these three things. Now this answer from Paul fits in with what Jesus had said at Mark 7:19 and Matthew 15:11. Well, Paul continues and repeats this same kind of counsel in other places, such as Colossians 2:16 through 23, and 1 Timothy 4:3 through 5. Paul addresses the same issue of eating foods that the Jews considered to be unclean, and his message is that no food is itself unclean. So repeating and summing this up, this issue that we're reading about in Acts 15 is about what foods you can take into your body. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10 cautions his audience to be discerning when faced with an opportunity to eat these things. Likely, they would be in the presence of other Jewish converts who believed that eating such things was wrong and defiled oneself before God. In those cases, a Christian must follow the three dietary rules and abstain from eating, and that means no blood. However, it is dependent upon circumstances, and it might be okay to eat, depending on who else it might impact. Now, I have a disclaimer so that you understand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that these things are healthy to eat. I'm saying it's not a spiritual issue. It's not an issue of being whether you're being defiled before God, which is what the Jews of that time thought. All right, what should be said to the Jehovah's Witnesses when they visit you? Now, when you respond to them, do not argue the point of whether eating blood and taking a transfusion are the same or whether they're different. Don't go there. Leave that alone. For the sake of the conversation, just move on. Don't argue that, well, transfusions are different from eating. We're not going to, don't do that.